Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about how to understand the mind. The presentation is entitled 10 Metaphors for Understanding the Mind. This is based on the large amount of research that was done at Leverage in the 2012 through 2019 period. We've spent a good amount of time thinking about how to explain the perspective on the mind that we ended up coming to. A lot of those explanations end up being technical. We developed a technical language. This is not surprising when one investigates something for a while. Frequently, you end up developing new words, new phrases, new concepts. That then makes it hard to communicate with people more generally when you're trying to explain just in very broad strokes what the picture you ended up with actually is. So today, what I'm going to do is talk through 10 different metaphors for understanding the mind. There are lots of metaphors that people actually already use for understanding the mind. Some of these they're accurate to a degree. The fact that people have so many metaphors indicates that they're somewhat illuminating, in some ways, some misleading. Hopefully this stock of metaphors will help to make it easier to understand how we ended up thinking about the mind, and insofar as that's right, helping people to understand the mind itself. The first metaphor I want to talk about is the mind as a sponge. There is a famous image of the mind as a blank slate. Anyone who has been involved in education, or just if you pay attention to your own experience of having a mind, you'll notice that it's not actually as easy to write on it anything you want. It's not like the thing simply starts off blank and then doesn't sort of do anything on its own. Instead, the mind ends up filling up with content. And I think a good metaphor here is a sponge. You'll hear people describe colloquially as though they're themselves sponges. They go into an area and they absorb all of the information. I think that this is at least a step forward in terms of a metaphor for thinking about how the mind actually absorbs information. You go into an area, it's not something that's under your control entirely. You just will start, your mind will start automatically absorbing information. I like the idea of a sponge absorbing paint here. We're going to sort of try to capture that a little bit in the image. The sort of information that you end up in contact with, that sort of information ends up suffusing your mind. And so that's why I propose that a first metaphor for understanding the mind is as a sponge. So if you're absorbing this information, then the next question is, well, what happens to it? Each of these metaphors, the fact that there are so many metaphors indicates that none of them are really capturing the thing exactly. The problem with a sponge, it's good for absorbing, but it doesn't retain things particularly well. You squeeze the sponge and all the stuff comes out, and now you're back to got your clean sponge. And this is not how the mind works. It's not possible to squeeze the mind and cause the information to spill out. But nevertheless, the mind keeps, in a sponge-like way, taking on more and more information. And this happens over the course of time. I think a good metaphor for this is a metaphor of sedimentary rock. People often think about the mind as, and we know we have memory, and you think about it as though there's, maybe it's sort of like a filing cabinet or a retrieval system in some way. A filing cabinet, it's like, well, you just have to know the relevant drawer and you open it up and you find the things. With sedimentary rock, it's more like you're absorbing information and that lays down a layer, and then you absorb more information and that lays down a further layer, and then you can keep going. You might think, oh, what does this mean in terms of how much stuff is actually in my mind? And the answer is, well, there's actually really a lot. If you think about yourself as absorbing tons of information from media You have movies, you have conversations, you have all of your contact, things you learn in school, there's contact with all of the spiritual traditions that you've heard of or have participated in. There's just tons of stuff, like walking around outside, experiencing nature, all of this information's coming in, and you can think about it as layering. Now, if that happens, then you might think, okay, well, if my mind is sort of like this sedimentary rock structure, then it's going to be harder to retrieve information than just as if it was a filing cabinet. Do you think that this is true? And in fact, something that we found in investigating the mind is that a further metaphor, the metaphor of mining, ended up being quite relevant, where if you imagine that there's a whole bunch of information getting stored in layers, then if you want to go back, in some cases you might, it might be on the outside, so to speak, it might be easy to retrieve, but in other cases you're going to have to dig back down through layers in order to find original mental states. We actually ended up with a bunch of ways of describing this. One of the metaphors we used was crust. This was because in areas we found that people had developed a way of thinking about something, and then another way to correct that way, and then a third way to correct that, and then so on, and you would actually get all of these layers of corrections on top of corrections. It was then possible to sort of remove the top layer and remove the next layer, doing this in places where you actually would want to, and that would let you dig into and get down to stuff that your mind had been doing earlier. Now, it might feel like a sponge, you might at times have it feel like you're mining through it, but when people interact with their minds, they're very frequently not interacting with them in that sort of format. There's actually lots of different interfaces for interacting with the mind. The one that we ended up using a whole lot was verbal, where people would verbally articulate the different mental structures they were paying attention to. A different one is the visual interface. This is something that we also played around with or investigated. Different people will find that in interacting with their own minds, there's a difference, or there's a preference. If some people, verbal will be easier, some people it will be visual. There are other ways to interact with the mind. But when you interact with the mind in the visual interface, you don't end up seeing sedimentary rock layers. You don't see a mental structure stacked on top of another mental structure. One of the things you'll end up seeing is there'll be visual imaginations or things that you can picture, but then you can explore, you can ask questions, and you end up navigating, when you're using this more visual interface, you end up navigating what is essentially this landscape. I was originally going to say mind as landscape, and I do think that that's a good phrasing as well, but I picked Imaginarium because the landscapes that you end up navigating are frequently really sort of weird. In the picture I have here, you have this large colored cube next to some sort of train structure on top of a land with a forest, and while you're investigating, if you investigate your mind and are paying attention and trying to describe or articulate what you're interacting with and ask questions, you may find yourself with vivid visual images, and it may not be even that vivid. You may have faint visual images, but you pay attention and you're like, oh yes, there's this sort of weird large cube. What's that? And then you ask questions and you find you can interact with it without translating things to verbal. Verbal is just a very sort of easy way to do this, but if you try to articulate the things verbally, you'll find that there's some sort of mental significance to the different things that you're interacting with. So this means that even though you have the mind absorbing information and creating these layers and the ability to dig through it, that's not always the way that you're going to end up interacting with it. You're also going to interact with it. For the verbal interface, it's really just you try to pay attention to the right things, hold the right intention, and then say things and pay attention to the phenomenology. It'd be interesting if we could come up with a metaphor for that. But when you're using the visual interface, then it is like you're navigating this weird and large landscape. So then you may think, okay, well, so there's this landscape, at least one of the ways of looking at it is this landscape, and it contains all of this information that has been absorbed from the outside. Well, what are you doing with it, and why is it structured in layers and so forth? There's a number of different functions. I'm going to describe a few, but you can think about the mind in terms of a description of a function. One of the things that the mind is doing is it's containing mental content that you have absorbed, and I'll add here also we've got containment system and central control system. A person might think about the mind as though it's like a blank slate, or it's like an empty box, and then you put something in the box, and then that's the thing in your mind. And then let's say you want to exercise regularly, and you find that you're not. Well, then you say to yourself, exercise regularly, and that's a thing you try to put into your mind. And this is a very, very simplified way of thinking how the mind works. If you imagine that the mind is instead bringing in information from all of these different sources, then there's a question about, well, what do you do with it? And let's say you encounter something that you think is good, you encounter something that you think is bad. Say you're trying to not eat too much chocolate cake, and you're trying to exercise regularly, but do you have the chocolate cake somewhere in your mind? I'm not asking a tricky Cartesian question about is the chocolate cake really itself in your mind in some sense. I mean, there's some representation. And the answer is yes. So if you go back to the sedimentary layers and you're like, what's in the sedimentary layers? There's going to be information about tons of things, and there's going to be information about the chocolate cake. There's going to be information about where you can get the chocolate cake. If your attention goes to that unnecessarily, you may find yourself getting the chocolate cake when you don't want to. So you're going to want to direct your attention in a way, and this is one way to deal with this, but one way of handling the fact of the chocolate cake's presence in your mental world is to direct your attention with respect to it. And so then the reason you could think of the mind as needing to be a containment system of a certain type is you have all sorts of stuff in there that you don't necessarily want to act on. I'm using the example of the chocolate cake and temptation, but you can also imagine, like, let's say you're angry at someone, and you're not supposed to say something mean, but you do have mean thoughts. Okay, well, how are you going to manage that so that you don't end up saying the mean things to the people? There's the fact of how you're going to contain the information, and then there's also the fact about how you're going to control your behavior given all of the information that you've absorbed. With this sort of picture of the mind, there's a way in which it's much, much less orderly than one might think. It's like if you set your goal is, you're doing a normal work day. Let's say you work from home and you're supposed to start at a particular time. You may have an external person checking to make sure that you're starting on time, but you have to keep in mind that you care what they think. You have to keep in mind that you care about performing well at your job. Maybe you're feeling really tired. There's a way that you're trying to stabilize your behavior, and you're trying to stabilize your beliefs. And we found that as we looked at people's minds that, this wasn't something we were specifically looking for, but I believe in every case that we looked, we found. I'll say we found it wherever we looked. There is evidence that people were stabilizing themselves. That's not a surprise at all. You can think about it as though a lot of modern civilization develops all of this infrastructure that's designed to cause people who normally would not behave the way that people in modern society behave to behave in particular, stable, predictable, and good ways. However much infrastructure there is in society, you as a person need to have interfaces that allow you to connect to the things that are happening in society. And people do this really differently. If you have 20 people, each of whom is very good at being on time for meetings, for example, they will pull this off in a different way. Sometimes there'll be some differences in terms of the surrounding social structure, the systems that are around them, but if you look into the person's mind, you'll find that essentially the connector cables that they're using to connect themselves to the surrounding environment are all really different. This will be why if you change a policy, for example, at an organization, as a policy for how you're going to do check-ins, this simple change, which seems like it should just, why is this not the same for everyone? The answer is that people have been absorbing all this information and storing it, and without sort of appropriate control, the thing would be really quite chaotic. Well, they have managed to control what they're doing, and they have managed to sort of sort the information that they're interacting with, and they have managed to be able to take reliable action. If you think about yourself, like compared to when you were really young, when you're 8 years old, are you going to be able to keep a 9-to-5 schedule? No, you're going to like run around and want to do other things. How do you get from the 8-year-old self to the mature self who's able to interact with modern society and jobs and all of that? The answer is you build this containment system, central control system, stabilization. Like, these are all things that are being done. You'll find that many of these things are hard to pay attention to because they're the things you're using to manage your own attention, but they are in fact possible to pay attention to in at least many, many cases. And then imagine all of this able to be interfaced with in this visual medium so that you have this large landscape and you can dig through it. Okay, we're getting closer to a more realistic picture of the mind. Now, I've mentioned attention. The mind is a very, very difficult thing to study. It's complicated. Frequently, the way that people end up stabilizing themselves makes it so that they can't actually investigate their own mind. So it's like if you imagine that the way you manage the chocolate cake is you just don't ever think about chocolate cake, then you're going to have a lot of trouble investigating that. If you're like, how do I, oh no, I'm thinking, oh God, now I'm going to, nope, can't think about that because then I'll go eat the chocolate cake. That's the sort of self-management that will make it very hard for a person to investigate how they're doing self-management. Not all self-management is like that. Some does allow you to investigate how you're doing it, but that's another of the problems involved in investigating the mind. I suggest that a further useful metaphor is the mind as a hall of mirrors. This is for a number of reasons. This is led up to this thing describing ways that it's difficult to investigate the mind. If you imagine that any object of study is surrounded by a hall of mirrors, it's going to be very difficult to study. The hall of mirrors metaphor corresponds to the fact that the mind is full of attentional redirection. So if you were to imagine the whole thing laid out in this big map, or laid out like these layers of rock, or like this landscape, and then you just want to draw your attention in a line across it, there are all these places in your mind where your attention will just bounce to something else. And so if you imagine that the terrain is itself made of little arrows, that the arrows direct which way you can go in looking at it, then it ends up being very, very difficult to pay attention to all of the different parts of the mind. That's not to mention the fact that the mind also has systems in it that lead to the replication of structure. It doesn't happen everywhere, but if we go back to our sedimentary rock, you'll notice, at least in this image, there are different bands of different amounts of width. You might think, okay, how accurate is that? If you imagine actually looking through the earth, you're going to find some areas where you find like a pocket of crystals, or you find some different types of metal ore, or there's just going to be different structures of different types contained in the earth. The way that that corresponds to the mind, or one of the ways, is that you'll find that there are certain mental actions that can be taken that lead to the generation of more similar structure. One simple example of this is going to be some of the ways that people think about using willpower. So let's say you're supposed to be working on a task, the task is boring, but you keep yourself doing it. And anytime you have some other thought, you like mentally think to yourself like, no, back on task. And so what you're doing is you're repeatedly bringing your attention back to the thing that you were supposed to be doing. In some cases, this will result in the production of mental structure. And then as you do it over and over again, you'll get repeated mental structure. That's just one of the ways you can get the generation of additional mental structure, or of like, if you were to think of this visually, you'd have pockets where you're like, huh, that's interesting. Why is there this little area where all the mental structure is the same? The answer is you're using a repeated mental action to keep generating the same structure. There are other examples. This is another way in which the Hall of Mirrors, I think, is a good way of thinking about the mind. Not only is it difficult because your attention is bounced all around for you to be able to pay attention to any single object, there are frequently many replicas of objects around. And there's going to be further ways the Hall of Mirrors metaphor ends up working. In some cases, in response to particular queries, people will generate mental structure of a particular type. This is the sort of thing that makes it hard to investigate what mental structure was there in the first place. If you imagine that you're trying to maintain a positive attitude, are you feeling discouraged? And you're like, no. And so what you did there is you bring the force of will and you bring your mental wherewithal to bear in producing a continued attitude. There are a number of different examples here. I don't want to think about how to describe the auto-generate or the generation of new mental structure one. I mean, maybe a good way to describe that would be, imagine that not only do you want to continue displaying confidence to others, but it's how you manage your own motivational system. So you don't want to think about whether you're discouraged. So then if somebody asks, are you discouraged? You say no. And that's because in response to the prompt, you generated some mental content that includes force and will in the direction of the way you want it to go. Okay, well, that is then going to lead to it being difficult to investigate the mind, as well as the production of sort of repeated pockets of mental content. Okay, so there's the Hall of Mirrors as a metaphor, and then a different metaphor. People often like to refer to the mind in terms of it being a computer. There's a sort of complicated thing. People like to think that the mind is software where the brain is hardware. That's a whole further thing that should be gone into. But definitely something that we found was that the way that people learn to be able to direct their own thinking involves lots of different mental actions that end up essentially constituting the code, where you then end up with lots and lots of repetition and inefficiency and so forth. This is how we ended up with the term debugging. The idea wasn't that you had some sort of root access. I don't even know enough about computers at this moment, but access to the original operating system so you could program it anew. It's like, no, nothing like that. It's way more like you're looking at this after the fact, and there's a whole lot of ways that the person has composed themselves mentally that on a sort of moment-by-moment basis made sense. It's like, well, they decided that to not eat the chocolate cake, they wouldn't pay attention to chocolate cake ever. But then that was like sad because they do like chocolate cake, so they then decided in response to never thinking about chocolate cake that it was okay sometimes to do whatever they wanted, where then now, okay, that's an interesting sort of overcorrection in the original direction, and then they end up not even thinking that the thing is chocolate cake. You could have a circumstance where the person's eating a lot of chocolate cake and you get them to report their beliefs and they believe they're not eating chocolate cake, and that's because they end up with the ability to not exactly identify chocolate cake because earlier in life they decided they were going to completely block that out. That might sound really weird, like, do you really have somebody who's eating chocolate cake and doesn't recognize that that's what they're doing? The mind is full of all sorts of weird little pockets of things like this, and this is why the analogy of undebugged code was really helpful. And then somehow, despite all of this complexity, we also found that the mind behaved in accordance with a simple set of rules that governed belief updating in particular, but also action in such a way that it made sense to think about it as though there was something like physics of the mind. People, when they think about science, think about mathematization. It's certainly conceivable that you could end up with a mathematized version of a physics of the mind. But if you look back at the history, some fields like astronomy start off with mathematics, others like electricity. It takes a couple hundred years before things get mathematized. The sorts of relations that we found were really simple on a conceptual level and had a very simple ontology that seemed to cleanly describe what was going on. This means that physics, at least mathematical physics, isn't a perfect analogy, but none of these things are perfect descriptions. The mind's not literally a sponge or a bunch of rock or any of these other things. Maybe containment system, central control system, and stabilizer, those maybe aren't exactly metaphors. Maybe something better can be said there because the mind actually does serve those functions. We did find, though, enough simplicity that the metaphor or analogy of something like a physics ended up being really helpful. So then the picture that you end up with here is way more, in some sense, complicated than the analogy of the mind as the blank slate. Even the analogy of a mind as a computer, the thing you're interacting with here is a way more complex thing that nevertheless can be fruitfully described and can be interacted with. It is possible to dig through it. It's possible to make your way through the Hall of Mirrors and figure out what your mind is actually doing. It is possible to find weird, buggy areas of mental code, so to speak, and work those things out. I mean, just to understand what's happening, but second, frequently to cause yourself to no longer be doing the weird thing. And again, in the context of a larger system that does follow sufficiently simple and a small enough number of rules. Okay, so that's it. Those are 10 metaphors for understanding the mind. Happy to open for questions or thoughts or discussion. So there's a document on the Leverage website. People can check it out, leverage.institute, and there's a overview of Leverage's introspection research, which gives an analogy between and talks about the physics, chemistry, biology, and ecology of the mind. You could ask the same thing about once we worked out relativity and quantum physics, did we go through and throw away chemistry and biology? And the answer is no, because you're interacting with an object from many different perspectives for many different purposes. Some of these were developed afterwards. The sedimentary rock and mining that occurred during, we didn't use the word imaginarium, but that happened. That was when we started looking at this technique called mythos. In 2018, we talked about containment and central control and stabilizing. The Hall of Mirrors, that was one I thought of in preparation for this presentation. We were in the Hall of Mirrors, but we never gave it a sort of metaphorical representation. All of this stuff still ends up being useful. It's quite tricky to talk about the self, not because it's impossible, but just because it's important to make certain distinctions. And this is something I've been thinking about still recently. I would suggest that the first thing is the mind. So there's a question about whether, sometimes people will say, well, maybe all the minds are actually secretly one, and there's some sort of hidden, underlying or overarching connection. Noting that idea, people's experience is certainly of having their own mind, where I'm having one set of experiences, you're having another set of experiences. If you think of the thing that is aware of those experiences and that has concepts and has thoughts about those experiences, that is one thing that you can use the word I to refer to. It's like the mind as such, where then for you, that's different than it is for me. Notably, there's another concept of self, which is how people end up, like usually when people think about themselves, they associate this with their body, with their, like, who everyone else is referring to when they say, hey, Oliver. It's like the persona, there's your identity, there's you as a biological entity. People end up with a concept of self that is a very useful thing there. And you say, well, is that really them? I have a more complicated thing that I can say about that, but I do think the mind exists, and I do think that the people end up with concepts. Like I do think, there are the physical bodies, the mind is in some way related to that. I would say that it's important to distinguish the mind and the concept of self, because people's concepts of self frequently includes a lot more than the mind. I think people like Descartes wanted people to just identify themselves with the mind. I suspect that that's not the right answer. In addition to the mind, there's the set of things that mind has more immediate control over. And so it's like, you have your experiences, I have mine. But it's your body giving your sense organs are giving you giving one mind a set of experiences. These sense organs are giving this other mind a different set of experiences. And then when actions arise from each of the minds, actions that arise from this one move Oliver's body, and the actions that arise from this one moves Geoff's body. So there's like a domain of nearby control that is useful to demarcate. And so I'd propose that something like that is a very, very useful concept to have, and also not just useful in a fictitious sense, like actually reflects something in reality. I do think this presentation can be improved. I've realized that containment systems is more of a functional description rather than a metaphor. I might switch that to holding tank, where then one of the metaphors I'm trying to figure out how to weave in is there's this idea of the mines of Moria. This comes from Lord of the Rings, where the dwarves delved too deep. They were too greedy, and then managed to break open some dark underlying regions, and then weird things like Balrogs and whatnot come out. That's not incredibly wrong with regard to the mind. There's something about it that I don't think is exactly right, because there's also good stuff, and I guess I just haven't geeked out enough over Lord of the Rings to really know that that's the correct magisterium to draw one's metaphors from. But it certainly is the case that digging down deeply into the mind, you can break the original containment system, and so the ways that you were managing yourself can break down, and that can be really bad and can lead to lots of chaos inside of groups. It turns out that a number of groups that have engaged in what you might think of as attentional practices, this is either psychological research, could be prayer, could be meditation, but things that involve the direction of the mind in a particular way, if you push far enough, it is at least reported that a bunch of different groups have had end up experiencing sort of really disruptive things. And I now interpret that and believe that what's happening is that the people are breaking down the containment systems and breaking down the central control systems. And I've heard people quip, well, they delved too deep. And there's something to that, not zero. Not 100, I would say, because it just sounds like a bad idea, but I think that there can be actually really good things from going through the mind and so forth. It's like if you imagine this massive, maybe this is the place where I disagree with that metaphor. It's if you think of the mind as it's also undebugged code, and you navigate the Hall of Mirrors and get to all the weird, clunky code area, and it turns out the way you're stabilizing yourself means that you can't actually think about A, B, C, or D. That could be a problem, And so if you figure out how to fix that, warning, careful, you're playing with the thing that helps you to engage in regular action. You fix that, though, that ends up being really beneficial. And so maybe there's going to be some metaphor like a sort of lost, unexcavated city that has been, filled in with tons of things and could be rebuilt. I don't know, maybe there's a metaphor there. I've got a question in the chat. What do I think is attractive about thinking of the depths of the mind as containing like eldritch, horrible secrets? What's attractive about it? Well, I think there are at least two things that are attractive about it. And you said beyond the literal truth. Well, I do want to say, so I think the first thing that's attractive about it is that there's something not wrong about it. There's a lot of stuff in the mind, a lot of what people are doing, even just things like someone doesn't really like their friend's friend at all, and they don't want to think about that because that's really socially inconvenient. So they don't think about it, and whenever it comes up, they try to think a nice thought. And it so happens the way they tried to think a nice thought was by putting the nice thought on top of the other thing. And so then they end up with this big stack of nice thoughts on top of thinking something less favorable about the relevant person. Well, if you structure a society or a civilization in general so that you have the good stuff being promoted, then you end up deprecating or trying to contain or hide all the bad stuff. And so then the idea of there being this bad underlying area is, I think, is frequently psychologically realistic. But then I do think that there's something also attractive about it beyond that. And let me see if I can articulate it. I mean, so the question in the chat uses the word eldritch and horrible. So one thing I'll note, and that's not included in this, but this is another way of thinking about the mind. When one wants to learn about the mind, you might think, well, let's go look at psychology. A different thing you might think is, let's go look at fiction, and let's go look at myth. The things, the stories that have been the most attractive over time are frequently going to contain, they're going to be attractive because they contain truths of various types. Even, fictional stories about, kids finding dragon eggs and so forth. That the dragon egg part is made up, but in order for it to be a good story, it has to be very realistic in terms of, well, what would happen if something like this did happen. So even in fictional works, it's, at least for good ones, it's mostly intended to be realistic. I think that if you look at horror, there's a certain dynamic that occurs in horror movies where typically not the people who end up surviving, but the people end up with some sort of weird fascination. It's like, here's an abandoned house in the middle of a landscape. No one seems to be there. No, says the friend, I'm getting a bad feeling about this. Let's just go home. What could possibly be wrong, says the foolhardy teenage, band that then goes in and finds really weird things inside the cottage or something. There's something about an attraction to objects of horror that I think is in play, and then I don't think I fully understand that. But so my answer would be, part of it is because it's true, and part of it's because people are attracted to the horror because they get caught in the horror tractor beam. It could be something else also. All right, any other questions or thoughts? Well, then let's call it. We will have more presentations, and we will figure out how to better explain the perspective on the mind that we ended up developing over time. So please tune in, and for anyone listening to this, if any of this material is interesting, do feel free to reach out to us at contact@leverageresearch.org.